Cersei, it turned out, had not lied about the wildfire. The moment Stannis' leading ships drew within range, green liquid poured from the city's walls, ignited by flaming arrows. The water itself seemed to explode in emerald fury. Flames licked the surface of the bay, turning men into living torches. A few ships tried to row back desperately, but currents pulled them into the conflagration, and many were consumed. The rest of the fleet retreated in horror, battered by the savage blaze. Stannis, watching from a vantage point with Ser Davos at his side, witnessed hundreds of good men die in a matter of minutes. The Red Wine fleet managed to stay far enough back to avoid the worst of the flames, but the shock and terror of wildfire had made its impact. On the southern side, Renly's men advanced siege towers, only to be met by a hail of arrows from the battlements. Lannister scorpions and trebuchets hurled stones. Some towers caught fire. Others managed to get close enough that men leaped across to the walls, fighting hand-to-hand with the gold cloaks and Lannister soldiers. For a moment, the city's defenders wavered, and it seemed the walls might be breached, but the defenders rallied. Tyrion Lannister, acting as commander inside the city, ordered a counterassault. Boiling oil was poured down onto the men in the towers, and the assault ground to a halt. The day ended in partial retreat. Stannis' men pulled back, battered and bloodied. The Tyrell lords, furious, cursed the Lannisters and the vile wildfire. Robb Stark, who had watched from the outskirts, recognized that a direct assault against King's Landing might cost them more men than the realm could afford. They debated all night in the War Council. Stannis was determined to press on, preferring a short but violent conflict to a long siege that would starve the city's population. Renly, unsettled by the horrors witnessed on the walls, argued for continuing the siege, forcing the city to yield eventually. Robb Stark listened more than he spoke, but Lady Catelyn pressed him privately, warning that a lengthy siege could cause a famine that would echo throughout the realm. A second attempt at negotiation was undertaken. Catelyn Stark, known for her steady bearing, was sent to parley at the city gates, accompanied by Brienne of Tarth and a retinue of knights bearing the flags of House Stark and House Baratheon. Atop the walls, Tyrion Lannister received them. He was flanked by Ser Meryn Trant and a half-dozen archers with arrows nocked. The sun beat down upon them as Catelyn began to speak, calling for the city to spare further bloodshed by handing over Joffrey. Tyrion responded that such demands were impossible. They would sooner see King's Landing burn than betray their king. Lannisters did not yield easily. The conversation quickly turned to barbed insults. Brienne bristled, her hand on her sword hilt, but kept her silence until the end. After a final exchange of threats, the parley ended in stalemate. The siege drew on. Days turned to weeks, then over a month passed. Despite the horrifying memory of the wildfire, Stannis was not idle. He used smaller ships in the cover of night to probe the city's defenses. Some men managed to scale parts of the walls near the mud gate, only to be forced back. The stalemate battered the morale on both sides. Disease crept into the Alliance camp, carried on the hot summer air. Dysentery afflicted many soldiers, especially those from the north who were unused to the southern heat. Supplies of fresh water diminished. Renly tried to keep spirits high with daily feasts in his pavilion, but even the Tyrell lords grew restless. Inside King's Landing, the situation was dire. The common folk starved while the nobles hoarded what remained. Riots broke out, and the gold cloaks had to suppress them brutally. King Joffrey grew increasingly unpredictable, ordering executions of any who dared speak out. Cersei plotted behind closed doors, contemplating the unthinkable. Tyrion tried his best to keep the city from collapsing entirely, coordinating ration distributions and patrolling the walls with a watchful eye. He knew that each passing day stacked the odds against the city, for the alliance was simply too large. The Lannisters had no allies left to save them. None who would risk fighting the combined might of the North, the Stormlands, and the Reach. Finally, the day came when desperation forced the Lannisters to sally forth. Tywin Lannister, having licked his wounds, slipped inside the city with what remained of his host under cover of night. His approach from the west was masked by a diversion staged by some Lannister loyalists who set fire to part of the Alliance camp. Chaos ensued, giving Tywin's men the chance to slip through the gates. Come morning, horns blew from the city's walls. The king's forces sallied out in a bold attempt to break the siege. Rows of Lannister spearmen marched under the Lion banner, flanked by heavy cavalry. Joffrey himself perched atop a horse some distance away, though he was hardly a figure of valor. The gold cloaks filed out, though many trembled at the sight of the massed ranks of the Alliance. Still, they advanced, spurred on by barked orders and the threat of the royal headsmen. Stannis, Renley, and Robb, anticipating that the Lannisters might attempt a breakout, had prepared. The Tyrell Knights swiftly countered the cavalry charge, riding under Renly's Golden Stag banner. Robb Stark stationed bowmen on higher ground, raking the Lannisters with volleys of arrows. Stannis held a contingent of disciplined foot soldiers in reserve, then commanded them to strike at the center of the Lannister formation. Furious fighting ensued. The Gold Lion clashed with the Dire Wolf and the Crowned Stag. War cries rose up, swords rang, and the churned mud quickly turned red with blood. For a brief moment, the Lannisters advanced, cutting deep into the Baratheon lines. Joffrey shrieked with delight from a safe vantage, believing victory might be at hand. But then the Great John and his Umber berserkers crashed into their flank, sowing chaos. Ser Loras Tyrell unhorsed the Kingsguard knight Meryn Trant, driving him to the ground. Jaime Lannister was nowhere to be seen, still a prisoner in the Stark camp, perhaps. With Tywin caught in the midst of the melee, pinned between the Tyrell cavalry and the Northern Outriders, the Lannisters started to fracture. Renly Baratheon, his arms still bound in fresh bandages, galloped forward with Brienne at his side. They cut their way toward Joffrey, for capturing or slaying the Boy King would end the conflict swiftly. A retinue of gold cloaks formed a barrier around the shrieking boy. Renly dueled 2 gold cloak officers at once, while Brienne dispatched another who lunged at her from behind. Joffrey, pale with terror, spurred his horse to flee back toward the gates. The boy nearly made it, but an arrow from an unknown archer found his back. He let out a scream and tumbled from the saddle. Panic gripped the Lannisters as word spread that King Joffrey had been struck down. Some loyalists tried to save him, but the press of the fighting grew too thick. Tywin Lannister, glimpsing the scene from afar, roared for his men to rally, but it was too late. The Alliance's lines were closing in with unstoppable force. The city gates began to shut in a desperate attempt to prevent the Alliance from pouring inside. Lannister men threw down their weapons or died where they stood, choosing to fight to the bitter end. When at last the carnage ceased, a hush settled on the battlefield. Corpses in red and gold lay strewn across the muddy plain, mingled with the battered dead of the Alliance. The gates of King's Landing remained closed, but the defenders on the walls began to wave white banners of surrender. Among the Lannisters, morale was shattered. Their false king had fallen, and Tywin was rumored to be gravely wounded, carried back into the city by a handful of loyal knights. The Alliance battered at the gates until the gold cloaks themselves hauled the massive wooden doors open, preferring surrender to further bloodshed. Stannis Baratheon, grim and somber, led the first wave of men into the city. Behind him rode Renly, less exuberant than he once might have been, for the horrors of war weighed upon him. Robb Stark followed, leading a separate vanguard. The city's small folk cowered or peered from behind shuttered windows, uncertain of how this new rule would treat them. Cersei Lannister was found barricaded in the Red Keep with Tommen and Myrcella, the younger siblings of Joffrey. She spat curses at Stannis, at the traitorous lords who betrayed House Lannister, and at the Starks. Stannis gave the order to seize her and her children, but not to harm them. He was not blind to the necessity of containing the Lannister brood. In the throne room, the Iron Throne loomed on its raised dais, an ugly mass of twisted swords. Soldiers from the Alliance lined the hall, still reeking of sweat and blood. The High Septon, summoned from his hiding place, was brought forward to witness the crowning of the rightful Baratheon king. Stannis, with Renly at his side, ascended the dais. Men knelt out of respect, though many had conflicted hearts. Robb Stark stood apart, flanked by Grey Wind, acknowledging that this was not his throne to claim. The Great Jon, battered from the fighting, let out a cheer for the new king. Tyrell knights echoed the roar, though some wore expressions that betrayed lingering concerns about the future. The High Septon placed a crown upon Stannis's brow, Robert's old crown, recovered from the Red Keep's vault. Stannis, with no show of triumph, accepted the weight, then turned to face the assembled lords. He declared that the false line of Joffrey was at an end. The Baratheons, rightful heirs of House Targaryen's conquest, would restore justice to the realm. He recognized Renley as his heir until such a time as the succession could be secured. He then proclaimed Robb Stark king in the north, granting him sovereignty over the domain beyond Moat Cailin. There would be no further subjugation of the north, and the Riverlands, too, would receive honorable recompense for the devastation they had suffered under the Lannisters. In the days that followed, the city's battered populace slowly emerged to greet the new reality. Food from the Reach was brought in under Tyrell's supervision, and strict discipline was enforced to prevent looting. Robb Stark, uneasy so far from his homeland, remained only long enough to ensure that the crown recognized the North's independence in writing, sealed by the newly anointed King Stannis. Shortly thereafter, he departed with his host, eager to return to his winter-bound kingdom, mourning the men he had lost. He left behind some aides, including his mother, Lady Catelyn, to assist in brokering terms for the Riverlands, ensuring that the Tullus would be restored to full strength and that the region would remain allied with the North. As for Cersei, she was taken into custody, permitted to dwell in a small set of chambers while awaiting trial. Tommen and Myrcella, innocent in many ways, were to be treated kindly, though Stannis insisted they, too, could pose a threat if permitted freedom. He intended to have them raised quietly under watchful guardians, their claims to the throne nullified by the revelation of their parentage. Tywin Lannister, grievously wounded, lingered for weeks, refusing to yield to his injuries. But with Joffrey gone and the realm unified under Stannis, his once mighty legacy collapsed. The last rumor said that, in time, he recovered sufficiently to stand trial in the Red Keep, though few doubted the outcome. The immediate terror of the war ended with the capture of King's Landing, but the realm was hardly at peace. The Iron Islands still stirred with Balon Greyjoy's ambitions. Dorne seethed with old resentments, uncertain whether to recognize Stannis or maintain its isolation. The Vale continued to hide behind the Aerys' high peaks, Lady Lysa unwilling to venture forth. Even the Stormlands, though nominally under Baratheon rule, had pockets of lords who questioned Stannis' new reign. Yet at the moment, a delicate calm settled over the capital. For Stannis, the greatest challenge had only just begun. The man who prided himself on justice and duty now found himself enthroned amidst a city of distrustful small folk, wary lords, and uncertain alliances. The Seven Kingdoms had effectively become two kingdoms in truth. The North, ruled by Robb Stark, and the southern and central lands under Stannis Baratheon. Renly served as Hand of the King, a role that at times seemed ill-suited for his youthful exuberance, yet he surprised many by dedicating himself to repairing the damage inflicted by the war. Mace Tyrell, satisfied for the moment, turned his energies to securing favorable marriages for his children, hoping perhaps to wed them into the newly crowned families. The memory of the war would long haunt those who survived. Soldiers in the Alliance's ranks bore scars, physical and otherwise, from the battlefields of Harrenhal, from the siege lines around King's Landing, and from the day they witnessed men screaming amidst the green flames on the Blackwater. Some said those who had beheld the wildfire's fury at close range never slept a peaceful night again. In the north, Robb Stark returned to Winterfell in time to learn of the woes his siblings faced, the intrigues that threatened the very heart of House Stark. The price for the crown of an independent North was steep, and he would pay it still. And yet, as the days turned to weeks and the realm adapted to its new shape, it became apparent that Stannis' alliance with Robb Stark had spared Westeros from an even bloodier civil war. By uniting instead of warring against each other, the Baratheon brothers had avoided the dark path that had once threatened to consume them. Without Stannis and Renly tearing one another apart, a measure of stability, tenuous though it was, settled on the south. The people of the Reach found themselves enjoying trade benefits, now that a friend of Highgarden occupied the throne. The Riverlands, ravaged as they were, held on to hope that they would eventually recover. Some believed that, beneath it all, a different threat loomed in the far north, beyond the Wall, where stories of White Walkers and rising shadows were whispered among the Black Brothers of the Night's Watch. Others whispered of dragons in the east, of Daenerys Targaryen stirring with newfound power across the narrow sea. But those were tales for the future. For the moment, the greatest political transformation in recent memory had changed the face of Westeros. When word spread that Stannis Baratheon and Renley Baratheon had stood side by side as king in hand, and that Robb Stark had departed King's Landing as king in the north, more than one lord shook his head in wonder. Such an outcome would have seemed impossible at the dawn of the War of the Five Kings. House Baratheon, once poised to tear itself to pieces, had consolidated. House Stark, nearly destroyed by betrayal in King's Landing, had won independence for the north. House Tyrell had retained significant power, and the Lannisters, though not eradicated, were decisively broken in the capital. The very tapestry of Westeros's feudal structure had been unraveled and rewoven. In the Red Keep, the Iron Throne's jagged spires loomed over the Great Hall as Stannis held his first royal court. The new courtiers assembled, from southern lords to Stormland bannermen and a scattering of Riverland representatives. Renly stood off to one side, conversing quietly with Ser Loras Tyrell and Brienne. Davos Seaworth, newly named Lord of the Rainwood and Admiral of the Royal Fleet, kept a respectful distance, occasionally exchanging nods with the lords who approached him. The torch of justice many called Stannis, for his unwavering sense of right and wrong. The small folk, half in fear and half in hope, prayed that the new king might restore the law and order that had eroded under Joffrey's tyrannical rule. Outside, in the city's crooked alleys and teeming squares, the watchword was caution. Bread distribution resumed as stores from Highgarden arrived by ship, courtesy of the Red Wine Fleet. The war had left thousands of orphans, whose hungry eyes followed returning soldiers through the streets. Northern men, uneasy with the southern climate, struck an odd figure in the city's thoroughfares, occasionally earning suspicious stares. Here and there, men in the gold cloaks of the city watch quietly removed Lannister sigils from their attire, uncertain what loyalty might mean in these changing times. Far from the capital's bustle, Robb Stark led his columns north, accompanied by the Tully Knights who had survived the war. He carried a deep sadness in his heart for the father he had lost and the men who had followed him faithfully to their end. Yet as he passed the Trident, he reflected on the promise secured. No more would the North be subject to a crown that did not understand its hardships. He was young yet, with many trials ahead, but a piece of him felt the burden lift slightly. At Moat Cailin, watchers on the walls greeted him as a king returning to his rightful domain. In the Stormlands, some lords who had hesitated to swear fealty to Stannis now came forward, praising him as the victor. A few recognized Renly as the more personable figure and quietly lamented that he was not named king, but the letter of the alliance had been honored. As for those who once served Joffrey, many fled, seeking exile in Essos or the remote corners of Westeros rather than face the new king's judgment. The Iron Throne had new men to advise it, new policies in the making, and a new reality in which the North stood apart. And so it was that the War of the Five Kings did not spiral deeper into endless bloodshed. Instead, it bent around the surprising pact forged between the sons of House Baratheon and the son of House Stark. The realm did not immediately prosper, for war leaves deep scars, and unrest would linger for years to come. But there was, at the very least, a chance for something resembling peace, or at least a lull in which men might catch their breath and see to the rebuilding of their lands. From the citadel to the wall, ravens carried the news of this outcome. In Old Town, the maesters recorded the victory in their annals, noting that never before had House Baratheon been so united in the face of a throne crisis. In the north, the tales that minstrels sang around the hearth fires celebrated the cunning of the young wolf and his proud stance against southern usurpers. In King's Landing, new songs praised the two stags, the unlooked-for brotherhood that overcame the Lannisters. Time would tell whether Stannis' rule would be as just as men hoped, whether Renly's political skill might help soothe the realm, and whether Robb Stark's newly forged kingdom would endure. But for now, with the Lion's claws broken and the false king's blood spilled on the battlefield, Westeros was free to imagine a future that did not revolve solely around the intrigues of House Lannister. Only the Red Priestess Melisandre, so the stories went, would speak of a greater threat beyond the mortal squabbles of kings and lords. She would murmur about the long night, about the cold darkness that would sweep the land, about enemies that steel could not slay.